Good afternoon, everyone. We have come to the last plenary of this 3-day conference, the title of which is Trust and Multilateralism. Without further ado, we have all the speakers on the dais. So I'll just pass on the session to the moderator, Professor Shantayanan Devarajan.
I'm not quite sure why I was selected to moderate this panel, but I thought I would share with you just two things I know about the concept of trust. The first is a Dutch proverb that says, "Trust arrives on foot, but leaves on horseback." It's much easier to lose trust than it is to rebuild it. And the other is actually a paper done by Leonard Wanchicon and Nathan Nunn in the American Economic Review, where they looked at the areas in Africa that which were intensive in the slave trade. You know, during the slave trade, there was a lot of broken trust among communities because people would have to give up even members of their family to the slaveholders. And then they traced that 200 years later to those same communities, and they found a statistically significant lack of trust 200 years later in those same communities. That tells you how long it might take to rebuild trust once you lose it. So to show us what the situation is right now with trust in low and middle income countries, I'm turning to Patricia Justino, the director designate of WIDER, to give a presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion among my fellow panelists.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here and for sticking until this session. It's great to still see so many of you here in the room. So I was allowed by special permission to have slides in the plenary because I really wanted to show you these graphs that come out of this work. And what I'm talking about is results that were published in the World Social Report 2025. And this was a joint effort between UN-WIDER and UN-DESA. It was the first time UN-DESA collaborated with the external organization to produce the World Social Reports. And it had very high level of support by the Secretary General, especially in pushing through the topic of trust in high-level UN processes, which is not easy given the political difficulties about dealing with these topics. So we're very happy and very proud that this has seen the light of day and these results are out there. What I'm going to say is I'm going to talk about the specific role that we had in this report. And for those of you that want the details, because I'm going to have very little time, less than 10 minutes to do this. If you want the details, there's a working paper by WIDER where all the data that we use is there. So feel free to peruse that to your heart's content. And this is some of the more theoretical areas that fed into the paper are actually a result of a 4-year project funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council, which came with me to WIDER in 2019. We came together, me and the project, and it's called Inequality and Governance in Unstable Democracies. So a lot of the thinking behind this comes from a 4-year research project. So what I'm going to say is teamwork. It's not just my own work. High-level result overall in the report, this is the number that's been circulated ever since, is the fact that 60% of people across the world report struggling economically. This is the highest number on record ever since the World Social Report is being produced. And we started from this result and start thinking, well, what's going on, what's happening? We've seen the largest progress in reducing poverty numbers during this period. We have Luis Felipe Lopez Cava here from the World Bank, from the poverty team who produced these results. We saw a large progress, technological progress, education, etc., but yet people are not happy. People feel they're struggling. And at the heart of it is insecurity, is a rise of insecurity and uncertainty, is the perceptions of the inequalities have reached very, very high levels, and that all the benefits are only to some, but not all. And what we see at the heart of it all is, I mean, I don't have to say much about this, is increase in social polarization, in social fragmentation all over the world. And at the heart of it all is this decline in trust. That's what I'm going to talk about. This is the global numbers that we have, the results. This includes all countries for which the World Values Survey has in their sample, which is just under 100 countries. And the main result is over 1/4 of the world population has absolutely no trust whatsoever in their governments. These are very, very large numbers. It's, again, highest number ever recorded. The larger decrease, we looked at the results between 2005 and 2023. Those are the parameters. And within those, the World Values Survey has what they call 3 waves. It takes a long time to run this survey, so some go across several years. The largest decrease is on a parliament, on the sort of the legislative body of countries where. And these numbers may appear reasonable, but this, in terms of picking up what Shanta mentioned, trust is something that doesn't change a lot across times, across decades. It can remain very stable. This large decrease then is a reason for concern. Normally, before that, the data is not so comparable, so we didn't want to make too much of it. We see a bit of fluctuation, but things stand at around the 40% level, etc. This is a very, very large drop. I couldn't resist, working for the UN. The UN is not doing that badly compared to national governments, in fact, despite all the problems that we face at the moment. So I couldn't resist putting up there saying, it may be bad, but it's not as bad as some other situations. Just because we're in India, just to give you an idea, these are the more disaggregated numbers for India. And we could have done this for many countries, but because we're here, I'm just showing it for India. Very high levels of trust in things like banks and armed forces and civil services. It goes down when we get to the press and the television. And funny enough, India goes against the rest of the world, and trust in the United Nations is not very high compared to the rest of the world. So but this is just to show you the kind of work we could do more disaggregated for countries. But here I'm just talking about the high-level estimators. So I'm going to focus just two messages that I can tell you here, but please do read the paper and the report for other information. One of the things that struck me was the comparison between low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries. I should say, to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that all of it is brought together in one global estimation. We spent about 2 years standardizing all these data sets. And what we have is, funny enough, low-income countries seem to have much higher levels of trust in governments, but they were the ones that across time saw the largest reduction. And going back to the discussion we had in the first panel, I don't know how many of you were there, a discussion about whether this is the time of the global south. It may well be, but I would take this as with a pinch of caution, because the large decrease in trust here seems to indicate that this is something that needs to be taken in consideration. The other sort of results that are really striking is the results on generations. This graph shows mistrust, not trust, because I just swapped the baselines around. And what this shows in one word is every new generation starts from a higher level of mistrust than the generation before. But this is only true for the really last two generations. So what I mentioned before, trust's pretty stable, but then something happened. And the case we make the result is what happened was the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. That really seems to have been the turning point at which trust sort of moved from a stable equilibrium at a certain level to a lower level equilibrium, and now it seems to kind of remain at that level ever since. Of course, we need to wait more time to see whether this hypothesis will hold or not, whether we are in a new lower level equilibrium of trust than what we were in previous decades. And now very briefly, I'll just, we did look very detailed what are the correlates. This paper doesn't have any sort of causal estimates. These are all correlations. Reverse causality is an issue here. And the issues that come up are high levels of correlation with inequality, with economic insecurity, low indicators of governance, low indicators of governance, crisis, the financial crisis in particular of 2007-8 has a big impact. And funny enough, issues around perceptions come up. Whether this is a cause or consequence or it just goes hand in hand with trust is to be determined. But there's this strong perception of erosion of fairness and solidarity, which comes up and goes hand in hand with low levels of trust. So essentially what we say in the report is we would really like to be on the blue side. You know, this is when, exactly what Shanta was saying before, when good things happen, they tend to keep on going. High levels of trust are associated with cooperation, with high levels of social cohesion, collective action, accountable governance, legitimacy, etc. But when bad things happen, then you very, very quickly descend into the red circle, into the vicious circle of other bad things follow, low levels of trust. Or maybe low levels of trust are actually an outcome of some of these things happening. But I'll leave that for our discussion in the panel. And the question is going to come, what do we do about? Well, this is an interesting one. Again, leaving this for discussion, so this is just a tease for the audience and for the discussion. We have the usual solutions: equity, redistribution, stronger institutions, global cooperation, etc. The problem is trust is endogenous to all of that. You actually, in order to implement these policies, you do need certain levels of trust. Now, trust is eroding itself, which will prevent the policies from working in the way you intend them to work. So what do we do, and where is the egg and the chicken in this as well? So those are the questions that the report raises, and I'll throw them back at the audience and at the panel and hope that we can have a productive discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patricia, and thanks for keeping to time as well. That gives us a good start. Let me now turn to Kaushik Basu. I guess he doesn't need any introduction. He's a professor at Cornell University. To give us, Kaushik, tell us a little bit about why trust is so important. Why do we spend so much time worrying about the lack of trust or declining trust in all realms of human interaction?
Shanta, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Let me jump in, given your question, by citing a paper which may well be Kenneth Arrow's least read paper in Dissent magazine in 1978. And in that paper, Ken Arrow's pointing out, and you must remember, for people not familiar with the formal literature, that Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand individuals looking after their self-interest, giving the social optimal state, the creation, giving it a mathematical form was Ken Arrow and Gerard Debrow's work. So the invisible hand theorem was proved by them, 1951, very famous paper, 2 papers actually. But Arrow is giving a reminder, and he's a very deep thinker, that all those conditions under which individual selfishness leads to optimality, along with that, there are hidden assumptions which we so take for granted that we don't write them down as assumptions. And Arrow points to things like trust, integrity. He says a normal market, if you're just checking up on your transitivity of preferences and concavity of the production function, that would not do. The market would fail without a minimal amount of trust and integrity and these kinds of qualities. In fact, he uses the expression, the market would fail in 10 minutes without these underlying conditions. I feel this is just extremely important. We don't give enough sanctity to this, and it's only because, and this refers to a little bit of what both Patricia mentioned and Shanta about the quick breakdown, is many of these implicit assumptions are norms which prevail in society till something goes wrong, and then they begin to crumble. And let me explain this also a little bit. You know, trust is a two-sided thing, that when you trust other people, you're exposing yourself to some vulnerability if others exploit that trust. When society is in a stable state, you trust others and others respond by respecting what you're trusting and you get back. Once this begins to crack up, it can go very, very rapidly. And I will give you one paper of mine, which since I'm sitting in India now, Delhi, I wrote this years ago. It's my shortest paper with the longest title. And this was when I entered the economics profession, troubled about one thing, the title of the paper, and it will give you the summary of it. Why we do not walk away without paying after a taxi ride. I knew from some college friends that it's possible to get away without paying after a taxi ride, but most people don't. This is a little bit of trust. Virtually every transaction has that element of trust that one side has fulfilled the job, and then you respond on the other side. And that is not explained by any economic theory. It's a part of our mindset. In a society when this begins to crumble, when you expect that the other side is not going to respect what you do, it can have a shattering effect on trust. And we have seen also in early societies, many primitive societies develop trust among the people. Then the so-called civilized people come in and then exploit the vulnerabilities of that trust that they have developed among themselves. So there are these variety of reasons why trust can break down, but trust is fundamental from Fukuyama's study, cross-country sweeping, that societies where trust develops, you begin to do better, I think is extremely important, and I will come back to some of these topics later if you give me a chance.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks very much, Tausig. Okay, so then let me turn to Farzana Afridi, who's a professor at the Institute of Economic Growth. Did I get it right? No. Oh, ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, one of those. To share her thinking about trust, particularly with examples from India and other places. Farzana.
Yeah, thanks, Shanta. So I'm going to sort of, bring the discussion down to India in particular, because we are here right now, and talk about the importance of trust from two aspects which are important for developing countries particularly. One is growth. So how does trust affect economic growth and development? And the other is from the point of view of addressing inequalities, and specifically why trust can, or how trust can affect participatory action, and why that is important when it comes to the delivery of basic services such as education and health. And so I'm going to build on these two aspects. And the first one, when we're thinking about why sitting in India, for us, it is important to think about economic growth, but not just growth itself, but it is important also from the point of view of creating jobs and employment opportunities. And we don't typically think of why trust matters in that. So that's some of the stuff that I'm going to bring in here. Is we know that the majority of the working population in India is self-employed. So 60% of our workforce is engaged in some sort of entrepreneurship. And the majority of these self-employed individuals are engaged in subsistence entrepreneurship, which means that they are running small enterprises from their homes. These are not large enterprises which are hiring workers and creating job opportunities for others. So this is not dynamic entrepreneurship, it's subsistence. And where does trust coming in here? So, if you look at the World Development Report of 2024, one interesting aspect that you see in trust there is that in countries like India, low-income countries, interpersonal trust might be low, but trust in family and in relations, close relations, is very high. So that's one dimension of trust that we are not thinking of. It's not one unidimensional trust that Patricia was talking about, of course, matters. But here, trust in family is very, very high. But on the same side, trust in interpersonal relationships is very low. What does that imply? That implies that when you're running these enterprises, you don't want to delegate the responsibility of running these enterprises to professional managers, for instance. You are more likely to trust your own family in running these enterprises. And that therefore means that there is limitation on firm growth and productivity. And there has been empirical research which shows that you can account for about 11% of the difference in per capita incomes between India and the United States can be accounted for the fact that this lack of trust leads to lower growth in firms and productivity, and that has implications therefore for jobs and employment. So that's number one. The number two aspect when I was talking about inequality, and I'm going to finish there, was about participatory action. So when we're living in a low-income country, one of the things that we care about is accountability. And we know that very often governments are not accountable. It is either because of corruption, it is because of many other issues. And so civic action, civil society has a very important role to play in terms of improving the accountability of our governments. Here, civic action is going to happen theoretically only when you believe that there are others around you also who are going to take part in this kind of participatory action. So it could be protest, it could be petitioning, it could be donations, it could be many other actions that you could take to engage other citizens to put pressure on the government or the bureaucracy or local governments to respond to the demands for better quality of these public services. And what is required in order for successful civic action is the fact that you need some sort of complementarity in participatory action, right? So if I am going to participate, then I'm going to do that only if I believe many other of my citizens, of my people I know, are also going to be out there protesting or petitioning and so on, because you need that critical mass in order to create any kind of pressure on the delivery of these services. So what is the role of the state and effectively the impact on institutions when it comes to civic action? And here again, I wanted to point out the fact that when we're talking about democratic institutions or democratic governments, then we think of complementarity in participatory action being important. But when there was this counter example of thinking of China, for instance, and there's this very interesting paper which is looking at protests in Hong Kong. And what it finds there is that what is effectively happening is not complementarity in participatory action, strategic complementarity, but rather substitutability. So if you know that there are a lot of other people also who are going to take part in the protests, but the state is repressive, it's not a democratic state, then you actually want to hold yourself back because of the fear of the state and fear of repression. So I think these are multiple dimensions on which we could think of trust, which are not a sort of, just one measure itself, but the different aspects of it. So I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much. Actually, and it ties back to, your last point ties back to what Kaushik was saying about the two-sided nature of trust. That's the breakdown in complementarity. Okay, now let me turn to Luis Felipe Lopez Calva. I should probably make the same mistake and say he works for the IMF, but actually he's worked for the World Bank.
Same thing.
Well, one of those places.
Yeah. Thank you, Shanta, and thank you to Wider for the invitation. So I'm going to make 4 points. The first one, starting from the framework that is part of the framework that we used in the World Development Report 2017 on governance, when actually Kaushik was the chief economist at the World Bank, and in the latest part of the process also Shanta. So I had the privilege to lead that one, and in that we talk about trust as a symptom. So the issue is, if you look at, if you go to the doctor and they take your temperature and they see something is wrong, in a way, trust is that temperature. It's a symptom of something that is not right. And what is it behind the idea of low trust? And we talk about legitimacy. And the legitimacy basically meaning, David Hume, a long time ago, says the most important question for political philosophers is, he says, how easy the many are governed by the few. And this is precisely the idea of legitimacy. And the way you build legitimacy we discussed there, it's basically, there are 3 ways, but we emphasize 2 of them, is through the process, by respecting the process, rules-based processes, so people accept results even when they are not in their favor. And the other is outcome legitimacy. So but the third one I will not discuss here is relational legitimacy, which is basically there is some identity issue that makes you trust some authorities. So the second point I want to make is that during the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of emphasis in the process legitimacy building. The opening of Eastern Europe, the transition to democracy in Latin America. So in parts of the world, the idea was to emphasize how you could move into this process legitimacy. But eventually, that didn't result in the outcomes that people were expecting. I'm, of course, generalizing. There is heterogeneity here. I think one important example is, which is still to be understood for many, is the case of Chile, which was the poster child of opening in the political system and in the economic sense. And nobody was expecting major riots to start in 2019. And then since then, it has been a process, very complicated political process in a country that seemed to be really in a path to legitimacy. When you look back in that case, and I'm not, of course, going to talk about the details, but if you look back in that case, the last 16 years before the riots, and you see the names of the presidents, it was Bachelet, Piñera, Bachelet, Piñera. So basically, the political system was closing until people saw that both in the political sense and the economic sense, the aspirations they had for something different were not being met. And then there was these major clashes. So third point is that mainly in low income and lower middle income countries, what we saw is that this emphasis on process was not reflected in outcome legitimacy building. We saw very mediocre process of economic growth, and we have one chapter in the report talking about how we can understand these traps in which the institutions do not adapt, and the growth model cannot be, you cannot transition from one type of accumulation model to a different one, more based on productivity. So you get trapped, and you have very, very poor process of growth. And in the social arena, you had the political or the welfare system turning more and more towards cash transfers, and at the margin, moving away from the provision of universal quality services for population, where the main loser was particularly the middle classes and urban middle classes. So all these aspects, we believe, could be associated to what we saw in the numbers that Patricia showed, which is a trend towards lower and lower trust. Final point, and maybe we will have time to go back to this, is how you rebuild trust. And again, if trust is a temperature and what you want to do is to build it through this legitimacy, I think the argument would be that the most immediate thing is outcome legitimacy. You need governments that deliver, and you need international organizations, and I will talk about that, maybe can play a role in that sense, a positive role, but the idea is how to bring about more results to people so you can regain the trust in the idea that you belong to a state that actually is effective in delivering in terms of your needs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luis, and for getting us onto the second phase of this conversation, having identified what the problem is in many dimensions and in increasingly levels of seriousness, I would say. We have to also ask the question, what can we do about it? And that's what the second phase of this conversation is going to be. So let me turn to Patricia. You were very good at identifying the problem at the beginning. So let me put you on the spot and see what you have to say about addressing the declining trust, especially among the young people that you showed us.
Yeah, okay. One thing that seems absolutely funny, I mean, erosion of trust essentially means the erosion of the social contract. That's what we're talking about. Especially when we're talking about trust, institutional trust. I should say that in the report and in anything we say, it's really important to distinguish between trust, institutional, what you call institutional trust, or some people call vertical trust between citizens and governments, and interpersonal trust among citizens, among individuals, and that can be broken down in various ways as well. If we focus here on trust between citizens and governments, what we're talking is the breakdown of the social contract. How do you build these? I mean, the real difficulty is what I said before, is in order to rebuild, you also need trust. It has to be a certain level of trust in order to rebuild it, and that comes down to issues of legitimacy that Luis Felipe just mentioned. Without that baseline of legitimacy, it cannot be done. And of course, we can say many things. I mean, one obvious, that seems at the moment, at the heart of it all, is this feeling of economic insecurity. And of course, the obvious solution is governments need to commit to economic security. But the issue is, okay, then the answer is improve redistribution, improve, social services, improve how policies achieve in an equitable way every member of society. But then there are three issues that arise. Citizens will only believe that those policies will reach their objectives if they see, say, let's pick up taxation or redistribution, they see those as a form of collective insurance rather than just a selective access. And the problem is governments with very low trust tend to go hand in hand with perceptions of corruption and lack of legitimacy. If citizens do not see that this is a collective insurance form, that will fail, right? And then we have, people will perceive that it's all about the connections, it's all about who you know, it's all about the networks, and you get into this vicious cycle of low levels in trust and lack of policy options because all this comes into play. And we're observing this in many parts of the world, including in developed countries currently. The second effect is citizens need to assume that there's a certain level of fairness, i.e. the others are not cheating the system. what I do needs to be, we need to know that others are not going to abuse what I do, right? So if we don't have this baseline of trust, then you see, people will not pay taxes. They will not pay their fares, their taxi fares for sure. They will jump queues. They capture benefits, etc. And once that happens, support for any policies in terms of economic security, redistribution, etc., erodes at the same time. And finally, where the money has to come from somewhere, in order to implement policies, you need revenue. Well, if there is no minimum of trust between both between citizens and towards the institutions, people distrust how the money gets spent. And then we have observed issues, tax evasion, low levels of compliance, and a shrinking of the fiscal space. So what do you do? Well, the first step is, at the cost of repeating what Luis Philippe has said, is the creation of this legitimacy aspect, the minimum bottom line that it's needed. Otherwise, low levels of trust will mean that the policies will automatically fail, no matter what we try to do. So you need that kind of baseline. So I didn't give you any solutions. I probably made things worse, but...
Well, I want to tie in what Patricia said also with what Luis Felipe said at the end to you, Koshik, which is what this sounds like is sometimes the most efficient solution. Like if you want to rebuild economic security, there are some better ways to do it and worse ways to do it. But some of the most efficient solutions may not be the one that builds the legitimacy. And so we have to start rethinking maybe this is the Canaro dissent theme. We may have to start rethinking our policy advice if the underlying problem is a breakdown in trust.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And I'm actually going to touch on a little bit of what Farzana said about trust and growth. Legitimacy I will come to, and I also want to pick up what Patricia just now was mentioning about fairness. Allow me to give one illustrative example, and then I will talk a little bit about policy prescriptions. This is not the kind of place where you inflict game theory, but I will do a little bit of game theory with you. There's a game called Trust Game, which illustrates many of the arguments that were presented just now. Our trust game is very simple, and I will just explain it to you. There are two players. Let's say that it is Shanta and Farzana playing. What I am the organizer of the game. I give Shanta $10, and this is his action he can do. Any amount of the $10, he can pass on to Farzana. It's like investing in a business, gives it to her. And whatever he gives, I treble it. It becomes 3 times that in her hands. And then she can give back part of it to Shanta because she would have had nothing if Shanta did not give, or not give back. So just an illustration, $10. In case he gives the full $10 to her, she will get $30. She can keep it. She can give it a part of it to Shanta, everything to Shanta. It's her. That's the last move. It's a 2-move game. This has been used in experiments around the world. Sam Bowles and others have taken it to different countries, different societies, and there are famous papers in Quarterly Journal of Economics of the game being played in different places. You can see a whole lot of things being illustrated. First of all, if in a society, the culture of giving back when you've got something is there, the outcome would be very different. But take standard mainstream economics where individuals are selfish. The outcome is very easy. Whatever Shanta gives to Farzana, it becomes 3 times. Hers is the last move. No reason for her to give back anything. She keeps it all, which is a standard rational human being would do. And by backward induction, if Shanta knows that that is the norm of the place, he would not give anything. And this immediately illustrates something, that in a society where this norm of trust is not there, the income would remain $10, whereas if the trust is there, full trust, it would become $30. So the trust is an underlying condition which illustrates what is possible through this, and you want to nurture it. How do you nurture it? And I can see Patricia hesitating coming out with a prescription. Prescriptions are indeed very, very difficult. The World Development Report, which I remember very well, which Luis Felipe had led that, there are lots of little suggestions. But let me point to one particular problem which I think is acute today. Inequality, I feel, is the rise in inequality is causing an erosion in trust today, which is probably explaining some of the breakdown, and for the following kind of reason. And this, it's conjectures, looking at loose data and what's happening. Inequality in the olden days would mean that the super rich, by the way, when I'm talking of inequality, it's a particular kind which I think is troublesome. The gap between the super, super rich and the average, when that grows, I believe democracy erodes, trust erodes in society. And why does that happen is, here is the possible reason. In the olden days, when you became super rich, you would buy more mansions, more cars, more yachts, more planes. Yes, it's unfair, some people having so much, others not, but it's just that. Today, in the age of digital connectivity, social media and platforms, you buy up a media platform, you buy up some other digital platform. So inequality is translating into a domain where it did not earlier. And I believe it's taking away the voice of ordinary people. It's having a silencing effect because some people are capturing these spaces of voice. There are anthropological studies that in rural areas, villages, when poor people are sitting and talking about their troubles in life and what the village should do, when the super rich village landlord walks in, the people suddenly lose their voice. You get silence all around, people can't talk. The inequality has a silencing effect. And I believe that today, this extreme inequality, and it's not the Gini coefficient or Lorenz curve spread over the whole thing, but more close to the Palma measure or some variant of it, the super rich and the average is causing the voice of the people to be lost. And this is eroding a kind of sense of being a part of society in a big way. I personally believe that you do need a heavier taxation system of a following kind, where you take a very high income. When the income goes above that, you have a tax rate which is pretty steep. But as soon as you talk of a steep tax rate, people begin to imagine that your entire income is being taxed at that rate. That is not the case. When you become super rich, every additional income has a huge tax, which doesn't go into any government coffer generally, but gets transferred to the poor. Somewhere I've written about it, I called it an accordion tax. It opens up like that. And one reason I do believe private enterprise is extremely important. You don't want to damage that. But this kind of a tax has an effect. When you become super rich, you're not trying to earn more income in order to be able to buy more cars and more homes. You're just competitive with the other super rich person and you want to beat that person. If you have a taxation system where you leave the relative rankings unchanged, the competitive spirit remains exactly in the same way. It's happening at a lower level. I believe there are other kinds. So the great inequality in today's digital age, this combination to my mind is contributing to an erosion of a certain kind of sense of society, sense of being together. But this does need study, but I do believe that that's the direction in which we have to go. The saddest part is most ordinary people, as soon as you talk about the need for redistribution, such is our power of brainwashing people that lots of ordinary people will say, no, that's not the way to go. Whereas I feel if we think through, and you do want to respect private enterprise, have space for that. But correcting for this extreme inequality that is happening today will erode, will improve, will prevent the erosion of many of the social, infrastructural matters which allow societies to prosper and do well.
Okay, so we have a proposal on the table. Farzana.
Actually, I'm going to throw a statistic out there, which is, I think we were discussing that at lunch, which is a puzzle, and that maybe qualifies what Kaushikda is saying, which is that if you look at the World Value Survey, then China turns out to be an outlier in terms of high levels of interpersonal trust and high trust also in government institutions. So institutions, so the question I'm trying to pose over here is, which speaks to this whole issue about process versus outcome legitimacy. in the sense that you have a state here or a nation where you have more or less high levels of inequality, so to speak, but also high levels of trust, which is a very different nature of government, with a very different nature of government. So how do we qualify this issue about the lack of trust being, or the increase in the lack of trust being affected by increasing inequality? And is it the case that in certain contexts, when you have certain kinds of governance structures, when inequality is increasing, then the citizens feel disempowered to be able to address or correct that inequality, and then you need a lot of civic participation to be able to pressurize the government in terms of, for instance, what Kaushikta is talking about, which is to change taxation systems or have great, other means of redistribution, versus your belief that whatever the government is doing, even if you are seeing inequality, at the end of the day, it is helping you in some sense, which is through the fact that you see outcomes changing, improving. So there is legitimacy in terms of the outcomes that you see. And this brings me back also to what we are seeing in our own country in terms of increasing legitimacy in terms of the delivery of services. But the change that we are seeing in terms of outcomes or improvements in outcomes are relatively slower. And that is accompanied also by, along with increasing inequality in India, for instance. So I'm actually throwing that out there rather than answering the question. And the second point I wanted to make was about technology and trust. So with new technologies coming in, particularly social media, which can act both as an enabler and a disabler for trust, right? So when I talked about participatory action, collective action, and so on, a lot of that can be enabled much more easily today as a result of the social media platforms, as a result of technology, which can bring people together much faster and form collective action opinions or actions or whatever else you can do in terms of sort of engaging with the government. But at the same time, there's a lot of lack of trust because you don't know whether what you're seeing or what you're hearing is really the truth or not, right? So I think there is this tension right now with new technology in terms of how it's moving us in whether it is increasing trust, reducing trust, on what dimensions. And then it again goes back to what I was saying earlier about two sides of trust and the multidimensionality of it. So how do we address that? So technology could be a solution, but it could also be a disabler.
Especially if the technology is owned by one of those oligarchs that Kaushik was talking about. Okay, Luis.
Thank you. So to stick to this idea of process and outcome legitimacy, a few words on process legitimacy. Where we discuss in the report, there are 4 elements that have to be permanently reinforced, which are quality of elections, political representation, which is there is a crisis of political representation now in many places. Third, social mobilization, civic space, and finally the quality of public deliberation. In many of these, as 4 constitutive elements of a healthy, legitimate state, or as Bob Hockett calls it, the politically constituted we. Now the bank, of course, or institutions like the one where I work, it's very difficult to actually act on those, except in the case of the quality of public deliberation, by providing knowledge, data, and evidence in a competitively neutral way. The worst thing that we can do is to provide only the evidence and the data and so on to the incumbent. We have to do it in a way that enhances the quality of public deliberation. But then if I move, and by the way, of course, it takes a long time, but this is the way that you have to work. And of course, this idea of the rule of law, that where rules are applied impersonally and the rulers are also subject to the rules. But we know this is difficult. I cite Gordon Brown's famous speech at the OECD when he said, in establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest. So it's a difficult process. But let me move to the outcome and where the new way in which the particular institution where I work, the World Bank, is bringing this. First is the idea of poverty reduction by job creation. So the idea is that the emphasis is on jobs, and we talk about the jobs deficit and how we can try to not only lend, but also leverage private sector investment so there can be job creation. But there are very concrete goals to which the bank has committed, and this is based on this idea of, think of this as the idea of the outcome, delivering outcomes to the population or helping governments deliver. For example, there is a commitment to connect 300 million people to electricity in Africa. There is a commitment in the next 5 years to bring 1.2, to end with 1.2 billion people having health services, 500 million people with social protection, with some kind of social protection mechanism, increasing the financing to SMEs through the local domestic banking systems and so on. So there are very concrete things. For the first time, there are very concrete things with numbers in which, you know, that the bank is going to support governments to deliver this. And if we do that, I think it's a way to contribute to this idea of the outcome legitimacy. Final point, unrelated to the corporate message, is that one thing that I think can be done, because one of the questions was, there's one thing you can do, what you would do. I'm very much in favor of an idea that Santiago Levy has been proposing in LAC and recently in a book by Wider, also in other places, which is this idea of moving away from the European style of social protection in which your benefits and so on depend on your labor situation or your job status, and try to move to a more generalized tax financing through a general tax, like you can call it like a social solidarity tax or something like that, both in consumption and income, and try to finance a basic package of social protection with health, unemployment insurance, retirement, and so on, for everybody in the population, independently of their job status. I think this idea, if it's well, thought through and so on, would be something that really would create a completely different sense of belonging for the population with respect to the state, with this idea that there is this literature called experiencing the state. Basically that when you interact with the state provision of certain things, you are not only getting the service, but you are experiencing your relationship with the state and trying to reinforce your sense of belonging in what some people would call the social contract, but in some cases it's not very popular. We can call it the political settlement or whatever we call it, but you become part of it. You realize that, or you reinforce the idea that you are part of that political settlement. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Patricia, you have a few comments on what's been said.
Just 2 comments. The first actually responds to Kaushik and Luis Felipe on the policies that can be implemented. Yes, but there's going to be a issue about whether national governments can do it, and that's for 2 reasons. First, the fact that the super rich have captured the entire system, so implementing any sort of any sort of taxation that will make them worse off is going to be incredibly difficult. The second is the citizens don't trust the state. So actually there's very low levels of support for redistributive policies because the governments are seen as incompetent and corrupt and so forth. So I want to just throw into discussion the role of multilateralism and what role, the discussions that are ongoing about international tax agreements and conventions, etc. Is that the solution? Perhaps. But at the moment, it feels very, very difficult for national governments on their own to address the issue of oligarchs capturing the entire system themselves, because you can buy the politicians, right? And we see that happening. The other issue that I wanted to throw before we go up in the discussion is, I mentioned before, the need to distinguish between institutional trust and trust between citizens is important. For instance, during COVID, we saw a bump. There was a decrease in trust it bounced back up. And it did, because the lack of trust in governments for doing the right thing was compensated by the fact that people from different social groups came together in a way. And you probably see that examples in many, many countries. Now, the real danger point is when you see a reduction in institutional trust, but also a reduction in trust between citizens from different groups. And you talked about the family, et cetera. Yes, you can trust your family, but if you start mistrusting other social groups, then this is where the danger point comes. And I mean, I've worked a lot on issues around conflict and outbreaks of civil war, et cetera. Usually that's when it happens. You don't trust your state, and you don't trust other social groups. And at that moment, it becomes really difficult to break the pattern, and that's and any policies are very, very difficult to implement. So just bringing it to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much. I just want to add one point to what Luis Felipe was saying about the World Bank going towards outcome legitimacy, output legitimacy, with the 300 million Africans connected to electricity and so on. It is dangerous if there's still this problem of lack of process legitimacy, because you can link up 300 million people, but still the electric utility is deeply corrupt, and it's used for political patronage, and that's the source of the process, the lack of trust in the process, and it'll come back to haunt you. And that's the problem, and that's what the Bangladeshis learned in 2024. Okay, now let me open it up. I'm sure many of you have views on what has been said, or have your own comments and questions about trust. So let me just open it up. We'll take 2 or 3 and then come back.
Can one of you reflect on the war situation at the moment, or what's happening in Gaza, in the Middle East, and Iraq? What is it doing to the trust?
What do you think?
I have a lot of thinking on that.
Well, go ahead then. Why don't you share with us?
I think we need to really take morally responsibility. Collective action in India is not happening. It's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, but not happening in India.
Okay, okay, war in Gaza, or Iran, take that as a question. There was a lady over there. Yeah, could you give her a mic?
Hello. I was wondering if you could speak about trust between the global north and the global south. Given historical inequalities, colonial injustices, climate loss and damage, and the classical economic system where I think a lot of people feel that the global south kind of subsidizes the global north through cheap labor and terms of trade. If you can just speak about the trust between the global north and the global south. Thank you.
Okay, good question. I see a hand here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to challenge Luis Felipe a little bit on the process and outcome legitimacy duality, in the sense that you make a point that it's process legitimacy is all good and well, but you need outcome legitimacy. But if you look at the world in the last 20 years or 50 years, poverty has gone down dramatically. We're in India. India has eradicated almost extreme poverty. Inequality, at least if you measure it in terms of income, has also gone down or hasn't increased significantly. Health, life expectancy throughout the world is higher than ever before. So outcomes have done pretty well. But the question is it enough if you don't have process legitimacy to achieve trust? So does it also go the other way around, and perhaps maybe more meaningfully so?
Let's take those questions. Luis Felipe, you want to lead off?
No, I don't think there is a disagreement, actually. The idea that if if you look at certain basic outcomes, like for example, poverty, certainly more than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty. By the way, in terms of inequality, it's true. If you look at global inequality, the main driver of the reduction in global inequality is because of between country inequality, which is basically growth convergence. Then if you look at within country inequality measured by household surveys, there is heterogeneity in some countries going up, in some countries going down. So there is not clear pattern in terms of income inequality as measured in the surveys. But if you look at wealth inequality, there is unambiguously a process of concentration. But you are right in the sense that when you have these writings by Deaton and so on, showing the great success in terms of many social indicators. That is certainly true. I can also tell you that if you look at people who have been lifted out of poverty, there is also like a threshold level above which it's very difficult to move people out. So it's still a lot of vulnerable people that are just above the poverty line, and we have to be aware of that. But as I mentioned also in my first intervention, some of the emphasis in the process legitimacy raised expectations about the outcomes. And I think even when the outcomes were good, I mean, I mentioned the case of Chile, many, poverty reduction, growth, and so on, but aspirations also were higher, and there was this huge gap in aspirations, and eventually the idea that it's something like a tunnel effect, a la Hirschman, where people thought, well, the benefits of all this process of growth is going to come to us. But as time goes by, you say, well, it's not really coming to us, so something is wrong with the system, right? You look at Latin Barometer, for example, in Latin America, almost 90% of the population say in the surveys that the institutions are created to serve a few people in society. So I would definitely think that there is a self-reinforced process between process and outcomes. I just perhaps my point was that if you want to relatively sort of restart a process of legitimacy, the most likely way to succeed is by bringing outcomes, because the processes take longer and so on. On one point, very briefly, because I'm not an expert, I cannot talk about all these global issues, but I just want to say that it's interesting to see that there is now the process of transition for the leadership of the UN system, and I think this is an existential process for the UN system. And at the same time, we have also processes of major changes in the international financial institutions, like the one where I work. So I think all these processes is something really to manage in a way that we keep this in mind, and how we rebuild the trust in these institutions, so we can actually eventually deliver better in terms of what people expect from these places.
Patricia, you want to take on the question about North-South trust?
I can try. In the data set, there's no way of measuring that. There are no questions about trust towards other countries, which is interesting. But I guess this is a reflection of global inequalities increasing, right? I think there's going to be possibly a almost perfect correlation. We know that is at the heart of why the multilateral system is being questioned. The feeling that the Global South does not have enough of a voice in the system, which of course, is breaking, is stretching the system to its limits and making it very, very difficult then to act at the sort of level of provision of global public goods, which ideally is what we need given all the issues that we've been discussing here. And it's just, and I expect this is just getting worse, as the gentleman here mentioned the war in the Middle East, and of course conflicts have increased in the last 3 years. They've been the highest levels of conflicts in the world. Defense budgets are going up. And they're going up at the cost of development cooperation and aid flows, etc. And countries in the South are being asked more and more to create their own fiscal spaces without external support. So I suspect the problems are just getting more difficult to disentangle, which will have consequences for us working for the UN and the World Bank and elsewhere. Thank you.
I would qualify that just in the sense that if you look at distrust or lack of trust between people in the North and people in the South, while it's there, I would rank that as number two relative to the deep distrust that goes on between governments and their citizens in those countries, both in the North and in the South. That's where the real serious distrust is happening. There is some of this in the North and South. And by the way, the global distribution of income has actually become more equal, not less. So if you look at it, that's a second order problem compared to the serious problems we're facing. Yeah.
Yeah, let me react generally. Some of these problems like the Middle Eastern war, and you're also talking of the North-South, it's tragic and I feel infuriating. A lot of people are very, very upset about it. But you must understand also that there is a collectivity problem over here, that individuals feel helpless very often when they look at a situation like that. And at one level, it is right that as an individual, what can you do? This is where top-down instruction, understanding of how these things happen, some leadership plays a very, very important role. Also in the global North-South that you mentioned, you have to keep in mind that we bundle these two huge categories together. But within the South, there are individuals who are taking advantage of many of this, so that is there. At one level, it is well-meaning people, it sounds too idealistic, but people with a bit of a moral compass spread through society have a special responsibility, but it's a difficult challenge. I do spend a lot of time on the micro-analysis of how do you bring these forces together, because at one level it is very easy to feel upset about when you look at another group that they are doing nothing. But you also, once you begin to dissect their situation, you realize that there is a problem in collective action and there is a responsibility in the leadership that we should generally push towards and try to hope that something will come out of that.
Yeah, I think on the process versus outcome legitimacy, I completely agree with Luis Felipe. So in the sense here that you think of aspirations and expectations as being dynamic, right? So the moment you are able to improve outcomes, then the expectations and aspirations of the population also increase as a result. And then when the governments or institutions are not able to deliver or respond to those increased aspirations and expectations is when you have this issue of lack of trust. But that also speaks to what Kaushikta was talking about in terms of inequality, because when you're able to deliver on basic outcomes, then you expect, the citizens expect more. On the global North versus South, I think the concern with climate action is particularly worrying. And of course, I agree that you can't look at the global South or the global North as a monolith, because there's a lot of heterogeneity within those groups. But at least for those of us sitting here in India, when it comes to climate action and creating this fund to finance programs and policies which would abate a lot of the emissions, and the need for technology transfer from the West or from the global North to the South to be able to do that in order to reduce the costs of abatement. All of those issues are on the table, and I think a lot of those discussions are also hinging on trust between the South and the North, which is lacking at the moment.
Okay, I think we have time for one more round, right?
Thank you. I am Nitya Nanda from Council for Social Development. My question is first to Professor Patricia. I was quite intrigued to see that in India, the trust on United Nations is pretty low. It kind of raises a question that who were the respondents, because our life is kind of day-to-day life is affected by what other people are doing in the different categories of people. But most Indians would not know what UN is all about. So given that, it's a kind of comparison is very difficult. My second question is to Professor Kaushik Basu. In economics, we have been kind of, when you go to the first classes of game theory, it's all about lack of trust, prisoner dilemma and all, Nash equilibrium happens because you don't trust each other. And now given that, if economics are spreading this, this so-called rational human being, as portraying human beings as people who are very selfish and not trustworthy. And given that, what is the level of trust that other than economists would have on the subject of economics and the people like us, who are student or expert of economics? Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to raise the issue of trust of information because I didn't hear that in the discussion. And here in India, there's a notion that in the era, the Yug of Kali, the goddess of destruction, one of the features is that people cannot tell fact from fiction. And I think the trust in information is really a underlying or overarching issue. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity. I would like to have your comment to all the very connected with our discussion about the green transition, actually, to also the speaker. How do you see the trust issue that we discussed? We believe that we need to go more green, more social inclusive, and so on. It seems that we pull the pendulums into more society and inclusive minded. And how do you see that this kind of new models of the green transition can bring more trust to our industrial path in the future? Do you see there's some optimisms, or there will be status quo with these current situations? Thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah. My question is to Kaushik Basu. I'm Jagveer Rawat. So, yeah, the macro level solutions, like prescriptions in India, particularly, I'm giving you a good context. That's the cooperative, and that too in last 70 years in Gujarat. If I take example of one particular district, Banaskantha, so there the institutional, cooperative as institution, and the households, if you compare that, then there is a big degree of trust there in a single district. And if you compare the next best district, like milk processing is the indicator, 1 crore liter is processed by that particular district. Next district is processing 40 lakhs. So a lot of trust is there if we see that kind of examples, alternatives, the cooperative to cooperative collaborations at the local level, local government level. So district level, something is emerging in India, a very good context. So that I wanted to point out, and I want to have an answer for that as well. Thank you.
Okay, no, we can't take any more because I'll start forgetting the question. So maybe, Farzana, can I ask you to respond? respond to Marty's question about information trust?
Yeah, I think that speaks to what I was talking about earlier about the role of technology, Marty, you know, in the sense that there's so much of disinformation right now. And we're not able to separate out what is reliable information versus what is false information, if you can call that, you know, information at all. That a lot of mistrust both between citizens and groups of citizens, as I think we were discussing about the fact that groups of citizens not having trust amongst each other may be a bigger concern than lack of trust between citizens and government and citizens and other institutions. But that is a concern when it comes to social media, and of course with new technology, with AI currently. Most of the time, we do not know whether what we are even seeing is real or not. So how do we address that? I think that is something that probably as a panel we should discuss. I also wanted to just say briefly about the data quality issue, and I think that's a very important point that you raise. We were having the discussion also about the statistics on China, for instance. When you, how is the question posed? Which individuals or households are sampled is going to completely determine how we see these the statistics on trust and how we interpret them. So I don't know how much maybe, you know, Patricia can speak to that better, but I think, yeah, those two are very important issues.
Thank you. Patricia, why don't you take that? Start with that. But also if you have any thoughts on the green growth agenda.
Less on
Well,
that.
we did have Luis do it.
Okay, let me, on the data, yeah, that's an important question. This is all based on the World Values Survey, which is a World Values Survey that interviews citizens in a whole bunch of countries, well, almost all countries in the world, asking the same questions in order to generate comparability. The samples are supposed to be representative of each country. They maintained and replaced suitably in different waves. But of course, I mean, the questions then are raised about how exactly so the questions are exactly the same, but the way different countries interpret them is extremely different. There are some experiments done around that you know, if you translate that, say, to Hindi, is not the same interpretation as I would have in Portuguese, for instance. So it's those subtleties that then may get to results that can be a bit interesting. Others is an issue, you know, since Farzana brought the issue up on the China answers. We see in the data almost exact correlation between high levels of institutional trust and autocracy. It's almost a perfect correlation. And the way, at least the World Values Survey, they have a disclaimer saying, you know, in some cases, people do not believe the survey is being done by an independent company. They believe it's a government mechanism, and therefore the results are difficult to accept. Hence why I mentioned before that Farzana really also mentioned that the results of institutional trust are to be taken with a pinch of salt. But the results that would concern me are the results on trust between different social groups. And the fact that these have been becoming worse and worse across time. It's consistent across countries. There's almost no heterogeneity whatsoever. And are being, just a quick word on Marty's point, and the issues like media is being instrumentalized in order to maintain that situation in a way. And it's being done in a deliberate way because obviously some people are gaining from the status quo, as Kaushik well put. So these are complicated matters that all interlinked into to explain the situation that we see and we find ourselves currently in. Yeah.
Luis, do you want to take the question about green growth?
Very general answer.
First, planet is one of your goals, right?
Yeah, if I may, exactly, livable planet. If I may quickly, you'll make one footnote on what Patricia just said, and it's to, I mean, we have to, of course, trust the surveys, but We were discussing with Kaushik earlier one of his papers called One Kind of Power, which is related to this, because we were thinking in the context of the speech of the Prime Minister of Canada, that brings back this idea where people are afraid of actually revealing their truth, their true perceptions about things. And the question is whether in less democratic societies, people are you can actually trust the answer to this survey, because people may be conditioned by the context to answer those questions. But anyway, so just a comment. So Nick Stern said once that he said, if we get it right, green transition would be the inclusive growth success of the 21st century. The question is how we get it right. And I think you have a very good point. It's again about what are the outcomes associated to that transition, and the idea is how we can do it in a way, what we call just transition, which has labor implications, has fiscal implications, has technological and sector-specific issues. So I think I could argue that there is not enough work being done in terms of how we understand all these different dimensions of that transition, and what is needed in terms of public action to try to make it really, as Nick Stern said, to really turn it into a success story. Final point, Shanta, if I may, on Marty's point about, I think it's a massive danger, this idea of the whether you don't know what is actually the truth or what is true, because it's not only about having different data, it's about actually creating facts that didn't happen, and people can think that actually something happened when actually it didn't happen. But in terms of the data, which is to the extent that we can work on this, there is a very, very ambitious agenda in terms of data and quality of data in the bank. We have the largest historic portfolio of almost $3 billion supporting data quality and so on. We have our statistical indicators, and governments care about that. They care about the indicator. It's a sort of healthy competition where the governments want to improve in terms of their index of performance, statistical performance indicators. So it's something that we bring to try to create better generation of data and so on. So to the extent that we have those instruments, we try to move in that direction. But a final point that I keep telling our teams is, we talk about evidence-based policy in the bank, but I think we also need evidence-based narratives, because there is a lot of narratives out there which are not based on evidence. And we have to be better at telling narratives based on facts, because sometimes we stop, by saying these are the facts, this should be the policies, of course, with some normative issue in the middle. But I think we have to be more proactive at bringing, competing in the market of the public deliberation by bringing these evidence-based narratives. And I think we still have to improve a lot in terms of that.
Just one additional point about the green transition or green growth, which is that when you start talking about climate change, you're also talking about trust between generations. How much are we trusting our grandchildren? And how much are they, who are still to be born, in some cases, will they trust us? That adds a huge dimension, which is why it's so complicated at this point. I mean, Barack Obama actually said, we're the first generation to experience the effects of climate change and the last generation to be able to do something about it. Those are the stakes when it comes to green transition. Kaushik, do you want to take on the question of how to trust economists? That's what you asked, right?
Question, Nityananda, I think, asked that, or, yeah. Well, I'll tell you about economists and trust. There's this very famous laboratory study by Bob Frank, Gilovich, and Reagan. I don't know if you know about that. Is in laboratories, if you make students of different disciplines do tests, economists behave in the most selfish way. Do you know of this paper? It's a very well-known paper. Economic students behave in the most selfish way. I have a bit of a generous explanation of why that is so. It is not that the most selfish people are being attracted into the profession of economics, but it's something different. If you read all the time that that's the way human beings are, they are selfish, which is what we do in textbooks, it's our axioms. After some time, you conform to what the norm is. So the lab control tests are very well done, but I feel the motivation behind that is very different from this being a group that is of a particular kind, rather than what they've been taught, and they are just trying to conform to the normal behavior.
Okay, I think we've reached the end. So I want to thank the audience and the panelists for a very interesting discussion. I think we have moved the discussion forward. I've learned a lot, and I'm full of new ideas to pursue, and I hope we can actually help rebuild trust in all aspects of our societies. So join me in thanking the panel.